Hello and welcome to Unstressed. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, today's episode is a rather unusual one because I had the pleasure of catching up with my guest in my own home studio, and we did the interview face to face, and it reminded me of what I think we have all learnt through this pandemic, and that is, while it's great that we have access to online communication, nothing quite compares to face-to-face meetings and talking and looking at people's faces and checking body language and facial expressions and feeling that connection with someone, which I certainly had the pleasure of today. My guest today is Dr. Traill Dowie. Now, Traill is the chair of the Australian Counselling Association Panel for Trauma Standards and Practice. He's also head of the faculty at Ikon Institute Australia and is a practising psychotherapist, supervisor and public speaker. Traill's academic life and public lectures cover a broad range of interdisciplinary topics that relate to the human condition, and we discuss many of those today. Psychiatry, psychotherapy, trauma, lessons from Indigenous cultures. Now that's a theme I'm really excited to be exploring this year. Anthropology, health and well-being, and human optimization. Now Traill holds 2 PhDs, yes, 2, receiving a PhD in psychiatry from Monash University and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Melbourne. He is also co-director of the Mind Medicine Institute, and I recently had the pleasure of talking to his co-director, integrative psychologist Nigel Denning. So these two episodes really do dovetail into each other really well. Look, I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Dr. Traill Dowie. Welcome, Traill.
Right, good to be here with you, mate. Thank you.
Traill, you've got so many things going. You've been on a learning journey. Well, we all are on our life, but you've really gone for it. You've actually got 2 PhDs, and you've had to pick 2 PhDs, and this time psychiatry and philosophy would be 2 very powerful ones to do. Yeah. Can you share with us a little bit about your own journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those questions, how far back do we go with all that? But I grew up pretty difficult circumstances, I would say. My father died when I was young, and we were poor and all those things. And I grew up in Darwin and Alice Springs, which were pretty rough places to grow up as well. And yeah, after my father died, I turned to books. So I started reading kind of philosophy seriously at about 11 or 12. And that just naturally brought me across actually into psychoanalysis, because they were next to each other in the bookstore and I didn't know what was what. And so I started reading Freud and then Jung and philosophy and all those things. And really those 2 interests have been the pathway of my intellectual journey. One follows the path of the role of healing and psychological practice, and the other is to deal with, deep thinking, clear thinking, the practice of philosophy, etc. Yeah.
But 2 PhDs?
Yeah.
That's quite an achievement in anybody's lifetime.
I did them at the same time, actually, which is very unusual. Had to get kind of special permission for that. But what happened is I started my psychiatry PhD and had moved a long way through it in about 12 months. And I was like, okay, well, I can start getting this ready for submission and all those things. And they're like, no, you can't submit it. It's minimum 2-year submission. So I was like, okay, what am I going to do? And then there are all these philosophical questions that I, hadn't really been able to explore or engage with in the way that I wanted to. So I thought I'd deal with those at the same time, and did my PhD in philosophy at Melbourne University, and I was supervised by John Rundell, but also Cornel West. And some listeners will probably know who Cornel West is, a very famous African-American scholar. And he's been someone I've been working with since 2007. So I used to go over every year to Princeton and spend time with him, and kind of he's been a mentor of mine. So that was a chance to kind of explore those themes. And then the psychiatric PhD, I was supervised by Graham Smith, who's a very well-known psychiatrist in Australia, and that was just really a terrific experience of deep examination of clinical work and clinical practice. So, yeah.
I mean, the world of psychology and psychiatry, how do you define that difference? I mean, it's kind of a medical-based pharmaceutical approach, but it's much more than that, surely.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of distinctions. There's psychiatry, psychological medicine, psychology, psychotherapy, counselling. These are all intertwined kind of ideas. I guess I would think about myself as a clinician, as a psychotherapist, and someone involved in the practice of psychotherapy. But, psychiatry is a medical specialisation. It's today dominated, biological-based interventions, so pharmacology. That hasn't always been its history, but that's certainly what is dominated by today. There is still psychotherapy training as part of your psychiatric training. So a friend of mine, Paul Kamel, who's just an absolutely terrific psychiatrist, therapist, philosopher. He runs the clinical training for the Royal College for psychiatrists, and he's excellent. You can't find anyone better than that. But most psychiatry is focused on that, on pharmacological intervention. Psychology, they're very focused on kind of evidence-based practice is the kind of term that they're really big on, and science practitioner model. And so, there's a lot of dominance in there as well on biologicalism and also a kind of cognitivism. And, I guess my view is that's all wonderful and everything has its place, but how does this all hang together? The American philosopher Wilfrid Sellers, talked about the need to understand how the world hangs together. And I think any clinical practice really has to begin with a set of clarifications about that. Probably my favourite, quote that I use all the time with my students is a quote by Gregory Bateson when he said, "Most of the problems in the world are caused by the difference between how people think and how nature is."
Yeah.
And so there's a real requirement for us to think more deeply, I believe, about how we orientate around these issues as clinicians, but as human beings more generally. I mean, climate change and all these things are all caused by these faulty modes of thinking and knowing, and a lot of what we do is contingent on a set of assumptions that we haven't really examined. And examination is what philosophy is all about. The unexamined life is not worth living. Line 38A of Plato's Apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. And so that's what I think is really important, and I spent a lot of my life and my career doing that. I've been very interested in exploring things like ethnomedicine, so I spent a lot of time kind of exploring traditional healing practices, and not for the purpose of being a shaman or, a healer in a particular traditional lineage, but really to try and understand what makes healing work, really the mechanics of it, and see whether there are cross-cultural things that we can learn. And I think that, we often live in a world where Western thought and Western knowledge is seen as the only form of knowledge. And one of the things that I guess that I've learned a lot about is through watching kind of Indigenous healing practices and trying to understand them, is there's a lot of skill involved. It's not necessarily observable to the naked eye if you're not deeply kind of ensconced in what's happening. But it's very, very, very interesting. And so, they're the kind of things that I've been interested in and looked at. And
yeah. I mean, I think we are drawn to certainty and simplicity as individuals.
Yeah.
And kind of our current culture almost reinforces that.
That's right.
It gives us shortcuts to it, but it's really not the way the world works.
No, it's not the way the world works. And, it's interesting because we have a lot of language to speak about these things. I mean, simplicity has the benefit of being understandable, but frequently has the negative side of being wrong. And people will often prefer a simplistic answer that's wrong than a complex answer that's right. And so dealing with and holding complexity becomes an important feature. Now, if you think about that in regards to human minds, and if we look at developmental models, particularly in Western developmental models, so someone like Piaget, this concrete operational kind of stage of development is really where a lot of our operation occurs as a species. Formal operational stuff, sure, but the post-formal register, which is really the register where people start to perceive systemic and intersystemic relationships and start to really see the world differently, that's not really something that's included in a Western developmental model very well. I mean, some neo-Piagetians have written about it, Keegan, Cook-Goethe, but, they're saying, 3% of the population, are in that post-formal position where they're able to see the world in those kinds of ways. So it raises big challenges, because if you have erroneous ontologies, if you have erroneous conceptions of what is, that by definition limits what you can know. So faulty ontologies create faulty epistemologies. And those epistemologies then form the basis for practice, policy, all of those things. But often they're wrong-headed. And so the question becomes, how do we think deeply about those things? That's not a criticism of, any of the work that's done. It's just that so much of the work seems partialized or not thought through or not held together in a integrated or holistic way, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, any of those terms become kind of cliched pretty quickly. That's where so much of the work is, I think, right?
Well, it's interesting, because I've described myself as a holistic health practitioner for almost 40 years, and it always elicits these kind of crystals and laying on of hands, and I say, well, actually, it's not a New Age philosophy. It just happens to be the way the body works. And it happens to be the way the planet works.
That's right.
And the sooner we get our heads around that. But there's been kind of a move, I guess, if we're talking about philosophers, I think Descartes was probably responsible more than anyone for setting us on this that's just my on this path of reductionism.
Well, that's an interesting point though, right? Because it's kind of Descartes gets a bad rap in this regard.
Okay, good. I want to hear
Descartes didn't say that the mind and body are separate.
No.
He said it is as if.
Yes.
And that little bit, as if, is the bit that it kind of got chopped off on
But
the
I
end.
think he was trying to appease the church at the time too. Was that a big part of it?
Yeah. I mean, any thinking done during that period is obviously highly influenced by those values. But I mean, his attempts, to think clearly about what we are and how we work, I mean, are admirable and useful and all of those things. But you are right to say, Ron, that Cartesian split, as it's sometimes referred to, is still haunting us today. It's still problematic today. I mean, I talk to students all the time, and I talk about minds, and they're like, but what about the body? I'm like, hang on a second. When I say mind, what I mean is an embodied relational process which is energetic and informatic in nature and form, okay? So as soon as I say mind, you can't speak about mind without talking about it being embodied. You can't talk about mind without it being relational. That is to say, it's involved in the world. It's inactive in some sense. And that's still very difficult for people to really kind of wrestle with and to understand. And there's a lot of conundrums that kind of get passed over, like one of the things that I say that gets people kind of flared up sometimes is I say that, all healing practices are an act of persuasion. All of them occur within a certain kind of register of relationship, which is influential. And when you look at traditional healing practices where they don't have, pharmacology and blood tests in the same way, to go on, what are they using? Well, they're using human minds. They're using human consciousness and the ability to influence human consciousness to generate healing outcomes. And so, in the West, we know all about placebo, right? You can't do a single study without putting. But what does it actually mean that there is such thing as a placebo?
Yes,
what are the implications?
We should be harnessing this all the time.
Well, that's right. Now, in psychotherapy, we do that. We do that through what we call non-specific factors, right? So it's really clearly documented that non-specific or common factors, as it's sometimes called, are essential to the clinical outcome. In fact, they're the most predictive dimensions of the therapeutic encounter. So these are really, really important things, and we pass by that. And I think that's one of the things from exploring and thinking about and really observing Indigenous healing practices around the world, is it's always performative. It always has a performativity to it. It is always done in a socialized context, right? So
which in this day and age is a very interesting idea.
Well, I mean, you think about our society, healing is really focused on curing, and it's done in private, and it's done in isolation, and, it has all these themes to it. And so many, I mean, one of the big issues is, of course, the nature of illness itself. In traditional societies, illness in the individual is a manifestation of illness within the group. I mean, look at our society. I mean, do we really think, for all our advancements, that we're not sick, or it's not making people sick? Because I think that's something that we kind of, the famous sociologist C. Wright Mills had this wonderful term, psychologicalism, and he used that to say that any ailment within an individual's life is a problem of their constitution, of their makeup, of their capacity, but any success was attributed to the culture that they're in. So one of the deep questions, is really about what is the intersection between health and the health of a culture or a society that we live in. And even though we have so much money and we're so affluent, we have all these resources, when we look at mental health, when we look at all these kind of things in Australia, obesity, we look at all these markers and metrics, it's telling us that the way we're occupying the world probably needs to be thought about in a deeper and more constructive way.
I think it's really interesting that you mention Indigenous health, and I know you explore this a lot, and I love the idea of lessons from the past. I think we have so much to learn from it. And I recently had the pleasure of talking to Tyson Yunkaporta.
Oh, great.
And his wonderful book, Sand Talk, How Indigenous Knowledge, just beautiful
fantastic,
book. Beautiful book.
He's at Monash, isn't he? Is that where he is? He's Monash?
I think so. I think he is. He's set up the Indigenous Knowledge Centre there.
It's just terrific. Yeah.
And it is. And he talks about the 4 protocols of Indigenous thinking being respect, connect, reflect, direct. And that we in the West, from the time of invasion, probably well before then, we've gone exactly about it the opposite way. This whole thing about connecting or being part of the greater good, and that being a reflection of our illness, is a really powerful message that we should, from the Indigenous.
I think this is one of the great messages that Indigenous wisdom has to offer us. But there's a certain hubris still around cultural dominance that allows us not to recognise there's a problem. The essential features that I would say is that the features of atomization, reductionism, and individualization versus complexity, relationship, and systemic engagement. I mean, those are the poles that we're kind of traversing in that conversation there, and very, very important. I think if we're really trying to make things better, if we're really trying to not just put band-aids on bullet wounds, so to speak, if we're really trying to make improvement for the people in our society and the world as a whole, then this kind of task of healing becomes, really important. And I like to distinguish for people that healing is not the same as curing. There's a sense in which what we do when we talk about these things is we start to talk about people and the world as a series of objects, of things. And I think my reading would be that that's completely wrong-headed, that we are not things, we are processes. And so what I mean by that is that we are not a static, fixed object. We are a dynamic process, and we really have to think in those terms if we're engaged in this healing process, because curing kind of has this idea of kind of returning to a kind of homeostatic position or being in a fixed position of health. And health is not like that, and systems don't work like that, and processes aren't like that. It's always dynamic, it's always moving, it's always working outside of homeostasis, it's always adjusting and moving and developing. And this is where I think systems theory has a lot has a lot to teach, just the general person in how the world actually hangs together.
Just let's talk a little bit about systems theory. Give us systems theory 101.
So systems theory is most famously developed by von Bertalanffy in the 1930s, but he actually had a progenitor which is not very well known, which is Alexander Bogdanov, who was a Russian theorist. And his theory was essentially a structural theory, that everything was about organization and disorganization in all the world. Everything is about the organizing properties and principles. And of course, when you think about this in relationship to how we understand human beings and human minds, it makes a lot of sense, but it also makes sense on a social and political level. The notion is organizational. Von Bertalanffy came along, and he really used the mathematics of John von Neumann and really tried to develop mathematical proofs and explorations around this. And he developed a very strong theory, and this theory, of course, went on to influence cybernetics and, has had a massive effect on our society and our culture, the development of systems-based thinking. It's, everything from ecology to family systems therapy is all connected to this notion of a systemic organization. That kind of got superseded, I guess, by someone like Warren Weaver's kind of approach to complexity, where he's saying systems theory is still too reductive, it's too mechanicalistic, because we're still dealing with direct notions of probability. When you start to get into complexity, what starts to happen is we start escaping the capacity to predict in the same way. So by definition, we're starting to talk about emergent processes and things that are much more how the world seems to actually be. And so there's that famous quote by Paul Varley, what is it? Everything that's simple is wrong and everything that's complex is useless.
Okay.
And so it's always a balance, right? So this is that tension between reduction and reductionism. Mm-hmm. Human beings can't help but engage in reduction, right? Because we can't necessarily hold the complexity of everything. But reductionism is a different kind of idea. When we start talking about reductionism, there's an essential value that the whole can be understood by the parts.
Yes.
And the whole basis of systemic and complexity-based thinking is the whole is more than the sum of the parts, as many of your listeners will be familiar with that idea. But that notion, deeply kind of problematic issue in philosophy is to ask, are we getting truly novel events emerging, or are we getting events that are actually, merely just the constituents of the parts? And I would take what was called a radical emergent view, which is, no, I think you get something completely new. And that I wouldn't say that that's philosophically popular within the philosophy of science, but that's certainly my view on that.
So taking the current pandemic as an example, I think, there are so many lessons we can learn from it, but I'm interested in your observation of the social psychology which has occurred during this pandemic. What's your take on it?
Yeah, that's a very good question, isn't it? There's a few things. First of all, the fact that we weren't ready for this is astounding, first of all. Yeah. Because we've known it's coming. Every virologist on Earth has been like, you got to be ready for this. And we've systematically eroded, in this country, our capacity to respond to it. We weren't ready for this, and it was very poorly responded to at a governmental level, federally. And one of the issues, I think, is that very, very quickly there were decisions made in a time that I think it's very difficult for particularly experts to behave in ways that aren't more explanatory and consultative. Is that we're suffering from a crisis in the faith that people have in their institutions. I would go as far to say is every institution in our society is failing.
I would go as far as to agree with you.
Hospitals don't make people well.
Yep.
Police aren't there to protect people. Courts are not engaged in the distribution of justice, and government is not representative for people. And, even bigger problems, even the discipline, a massive institution worldwide like science, the fact that people have lost faith in science, it's really troubling that this is going on. So I would say that you have all this happening, and I would have liked to have seen more discussion about how we were going to approach public health, because there were people asking questions like, do we evaluate risk in terms of loss of life, or do we evaluate in terms of years of life lost? Completely different story, and they create different outcomes. Now, I'm certainly, in terms of this virus and stuff, my stance on it is a fairly conservative one. I have a serious heart condition. My brother had a cardiac arrest when he had COVID. I'm like, well, this is,
it's serious. There's no question it's serious.
Well, yeah, but there is a question for a lot of people whether it's serious. A lot of people, treat it like it's a cold or something. But and this comes back to my point, is the lack of social cohesion around these things. And this has to do a lot with how people receive information. And what I would say is this: good decision making requires a few things. First of all, what you need is good data. You can't make good decisions without good information. The next thing you need is thinking tools or sense-making tools, whatever you want to call them. And then what you have is the decision process. Now, we have a situation where all data essentially is corrupted.
Yes.
Right? So the information that everyday citizens are receiving is manicured and presented to them to maintain their interest in order to deal with, technological distractions and, to get clicks and all these things, right? So all the data is immediately corrupted.
Yeah.
All right. And then we have the ongoing problem then of that data corruption extending into other domains. So we're lied to, for example, by politicians or whatever happens. So the information itself is corrupted. But if you had really good sense-making skills, if you had really good thinking tools, then maybe you could fill in the gaps, you could fit your way through it. But unfortunately, most people have really poorly developed thinking tools. So we have a situation where we've got poor data, poor thinking tools. The only outcome from that can be poor decisions. And I think that, we as a society are wrestling with this, and the poor incentives of our society, and it is a poor set of incentives that we live by, are causing a great deal of problems. And, the chickens come home to roost.
Yeah.
That's basically the way that it goes.
Yeah. I personally, when the pandemic came, I saw it as an incredible opportunity for public health. You had a global population focused on public health like never before, but it seems to have been lost. And I think many of your points are so valid. One of them, of course, speaks to our education system, is another one that has let us down. And you talk about critical thinking and collaboration and community. Talk to us about how you perceive the education system as a factor of what's going on now.
Well, I work as an educator. It's one of my roles. I'm an educator, and I have been for 20 years, been training psychotherapists for 20 years now. And I'm the head of school at an organisation called the Ikon Institute. And, I've developed a pedagogical approach there, which is based on my personal experiences and my education, and also my experiences of being at very prestigious universities in the United States and watching what actually happens at the best places in the world is very different to what we see in, classrooms in Australia. This all kind of begins, I think, in earnest in the 1980s, when we see the corporatisation of universities. And it's a real tragedy in some ways that we've lost the ability to understand the value of education for itself. And so, always already now, we get these kind of comments, well, where's the value in that? Where's the utility in that? Where's the money in that? There's a great example of that, Ron, when the pandemic hit, actually. And I saw a survey in the newspaper asking whether or not artists should receive JobKeeper.
Right, yes.
And an inordinate number of people were saying no.
Yes, I know.
And then what they were doing is they were sitting at home watching content produced by artists, listening to content produced by artists. And so this kind of real kind of breakdown of the value of liberal arts, deep education, not the shallow education where people are simply after a vocational experience. They want a piece of paper to then go out and make money. But that's very much the tone of education in Australia. What I focus on, in the pedagogy that I put forward is what is called a transformative educational model, which is the idea that the education should transform the person. And when I'm teaching this, I take it back to, the classical Greek ideas of paideia, parrhesia, and phronesis. So phronesis is, applied wisdom. It's the skill of doing the work. It's the actual ability to apply it. Parrhesia is fearless and frank speech. And that's a hard thing to do in today's society, given the whole development of woke culture and those things. And then there's paideia, and paideia is the Greek word for education. Listeners might recognise it from the word encyclopedia. It's that bit at the end. And Cornel West, my great mentor, he always raises these issues with me, and that's where I've kind of picked them up from, of course. He says, paideia is the maturation of one's soul through death.
Okay.
And that's what education really means. It means to give up what you think you are,
yes, to
become what you can be.
Yeah.
And it's to come into contact with ideas and thoughts that radically change who you are and how you perceive the world. Cornel would often say to me, all these people come to these classes only to discover that their whole worldview is built on pudding. Sweet, fluffy, and without substance. And so deep education is the process of really unhousing people, really allowing them to take their own mind seriously. I mean, this is one of the things that I say to my students all the time: take your own mind seriously. But the education experience for most people has beaten out of them any belief that their mind is something that should be taken seriously. And so we have to take our own mind seriously. We have to engage with it. We have to think deeply. And as I like to say, you've got to catch on fire.
I've heard you say that expression, catching on fire with education.
Yeah.
I think, when we're talking about going out and knowing oneself, arguably, there's never been a more important time in human history to know yourself, because the data knows us better than we know ourselves. And we're sitting ducks.
The algorithms. Yes, no, exactly. And this idea of, really catching on fire, it's something that's really hard to explain from the outside, because a lot of people haven't experienced it. But there is a kind of vitality that comes out of the life of the mind. One of my favourite philosophers, Hannah Arendt, she wrote a book called The Life of the Mind. And this idea of you can be in a room by yourself reading a text, and it can be, when you're on fire like that, you can be so alive with it that it's almost unbearable. You can't, it's too much. There's too much going on, too much stimulation, too much thinking, it can almost be overwhelming at times. And you juxtapose that against, sitting at home and, watching Netflix or, the married TV shows or whatever it is that people watch. And there's a real tension here between essentially providing people with a set of narcotics, whether TV, sport, food, whatever it is. Jose Gasset Ortega said, show me what you attend to and I'll show you what kind of person you are. So what do we attend to? We attend to self-interest, we attend to money, we attend to all these things. And I'm not saying those things are bad in and of themselves, but when that's all that you attend to, where do we end up?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people through the pandemic have really started to wake up to the fact that there's more to living. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is it. This is it.
Yeah.
You know, and if you're going to spend, 70% of your life working somewhere that makes you miserable and unhappy, you might need to rethink that. And you might need to really think that maybe I'm better off being poor and happy.
Yeah. Well, it's been a big opportunity for people to reflect.
Or the Great Resignation, as they're calling it.
Great Resignation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people are realising how much their actual work costs them in terms of their lives. And
relationships.
asking whether it's worth it or not. I think another word that comes to my mind when I think of education in general and this pandemic in particular is ignorance.
Yeah. And
it can either be a powerful force or a just very scary one. I think it's been a scary one. How should we approach ignorance? Well, how do people approach ignorance?
Well, I mean, I think ignorance is highly problematic. There is, of course, the tension between knowing that you're ignorant and believing that you know everything. I mean, this is one of the great tensions. One of the questions I ask people, for example, when I encounter people who have strong, and again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be critical of the health policy and the social health policies that are rolled out. I'm not saying any of those things, and I think there's lots of problems in the way this has all been handled. But one of the questions that I ask people is, what is it that a professor of virology knows that you don't know? Is there anything that they know that you don't know? Because there's this interesting quality of, you raise the question of ignorance, and I would flip that. And I would ask the question of what constitutes the wise. And one of the constitutive dimensions of wisdom, pretty much, there's lots of definitions, but one of the constitutive dimensions universally is what they call epistemic humility.
Yes, that was a word I wanted to explore with you. Tell me those words. Tell me about that.
Well, epistemic humility, being humble about what you know. Being really kind of able to recognize that you don't know everything, that there's other things to discover, there's other things to learn. And so having this position of epistemic humility means to go, well, look, I'm not a virologist, I'm not a cardiologist, I'm none of those things. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm going to wholesalely just agree and follow what I'm told, but I am going to begin with the starting point that this person knows something that I don't know. And, this is an important point, because when we live in a world where ignorance is not only kind of dominant, but it's almost privileged.
Yes.
It's almost privileged, like the work of thinking, you asked this question about universities before. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, that the whole currency of universities now is publish or perish. People producing small, highly specialized journal articles that get published and read by, a handful of people, rather than what I would call an attention to what is wise. And for me, this is one of those tensions in philosophy between professional philosophy and the historical practice of philosophy. And I think that knowledge is not the same as wisdom. And I think that you can have a lot of knowledge and still be unwise. And so, for me, I think this pursuit of wisdom, whatever that looks like for an individual, is really important. But to do that, it requires a certain state of self-reflection, and it requires certain thinking tools. And unfortunately, most of our society has had those thinking tools eroded. Like, I'll tell you right now, I've been teaching for 20 years. People read less today than they ever have in any time. Like, getting students to read is very, very hard. And the volume of reading as well. Like, what's expected as a volume of reading today is, I constantly get in trouble with this with our quality assurance team at Ikon, because I'm like, wow, they should be able to read this book in a week, shouldn't they? And they're like, no, Traill, it's got to be, 50 pages. I'm like, well, but this is full-time study. What do they do? So there's these real poor incentives that we keep following, and the consequences are what we're reaping. And if you think about our current society, where there's so much focus, I think, on people's rights,
Yes.
but very little focus on their responsibilities.
Yeah.
And rights and responsibilities are fused. There are no rights without responsibilities. And so what are our responsibilities as citizens? What are our responsibilities as individuals within a broader network of relationships? Those questions don't really get addressed systematically.
I mean, we've come this age in the last 20, 30 years, the age of the individual. It's delivered some good things: individual rights of, domestic violence, sexual rights, the rights of the child, and all that sort of individual rights. But it's kind of become an obsession.
Yeah, it's interesting. This kind of, I guess you're referring to a kind of a social and cultural preciousness as well that's kind of been developed. I often reflect upon that. There's probably never been a time where we've been allowed to be so sensitized to trauma, to, negative psychological valence. Like, you can only do that in a really privileged world. And there's this explosion of all that. Some of it very misguided. I mean, some of it doesn't even make sense inside the doctrines which are being put forward. But, we can say that the general project of freedom and liberation is a good one. I mean, I don't think any reasonable citizen would say that people who are black, brown, yellow shouldn't be treated as ordinary human beings in a society like Australia. I mean, I feel like that should now be a given. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that it wasn't a given, and the legacy of that is still being felt, and it's not to diminish that at all. But there's a certain popularity, I think, and a certain cultural and social currency in attitudes of victimization. And you've got to be careful saying that even in a public forum like this. It can be risky. And again, I don't mean that to be derogatory. I mean that to say that, and I'm not even saying it's necessarily bad, but if we continue to do it forever, where does it lead us? Yeah,
I think your point that it comes with responsibility, and that responsibility is to the bigger picture, is a really valid one. But it also leads to this whole idea of trauma.
Yeah.
Because, I recently had the pleasure of talking to Admiral Chris Barry, following on from that psychedelic summit that was fabulous. I mean, on my desk here, I've got the name of all the people that I want to invite on. And there were some brilliant speakers. But what surprised me was Chris Barry's presence there. And then I really thought, okay, servicemen, post-traumatic stress and all that. But he made the point that trauma, post-traumatic stress affects every Australian. A big statement. And I said, gee, Chris. And he said, well, either they did experience the trauma or you're living with someone who has experienced the trauma and that is affecting you. And trauma is such a personal thing. Mine isn't more traumatic than yours. Mine is my trauma and effect. So talk to us a bit about trauma.
Great question.
In this age of the individual.
Yeah, well, I want to be kind of more clarifying definitionally about it, first of all. So I think that often suffering gets described as trauma. I think grief gets described as trauma. Those are different categories of human experience. Trauma is a very particular category of human experience, I think, and it depends how you'd like to articulate that. But let us say that a traumatic experience is an experience which is too sharp, too violent to be experienced. That is to say, it's an unexperienceable experience. There's a whole bunch of psychophysiological responses that happen in all of that, and there are certain phenomenal characteristics of it. Most notably for me is the disruption to temporality and time. So if you're really trying to understand the life world, the lived experience of a traumatized person, the essential feature, I mean, there's a number of them, but I think the most important is time, is that the traumatized person is not in present time orientated towards a future. What they are is trapped in a loop of the past. Mm-hmm. There's a sense of being unable to escape. And when you talk to veterans or traumatized persons, there's often this quality. And so trauma sits outside of time. It sits outside of direct experience. And so the treatment of trauma always involves turning trauma into suffering. It always involves taking the unexperienceable experience and experiencing it in small, digestible amounts. And whether you do that from the bottom up, or you do that from the top down, or the inside out, or the outside in, or whatever way you want to do it, that's fine. But really what it is it's a chance to work that unclaimed experience through. And this is what we do in psychotherapy when we're specialising in treating trauma victims. There's a lot of difference in trauma, and so one of the things that I'm very interested in is that often we try and say that the soldier is the same as the molestation victim, who's the same as the fire or flood victim. They all get it's all the same, it's all trauma. And what I would say is no, they're actually all categorically different experiences. They all have a different quality to them. When you work with soldiers, for example, a big part of what traumatizes them is not just what they saw, but what they did. And so they've sustained a moral injury. We've sent young men off to kill people, which is a counter-social activity. They have to overcome their natural biological instinct not to harm each other. It's a famous book written by David Grossman called On Killing. He was the dean at West Point. Mm-hmm. And he says, one of the most difficult things in training soldiers is loosening their capacity to kill. Right? And so what they did all this exploration into essentially trying to create an on and off switch for a sociopath. I want to be able to put them out there in the environment and they're not constrained by all their biology and all their social kind of tendencies to not harm other human beings. So we develop all these strategies. There's formulas. As grotesque as this is, there's formulas. The type of weapons used, distance from the person, all those things to try and allow that person to murder other living human beings. And we, of course, make the other human beings other. They're not humans, they're not dads, they're not mums, they're not people. We give them some derogatory term and we treat them as such. Now, those people come home, they may have experienced terrible things happening to them. They may have seen terrible things happen to their comrades, but also they have to wrestle with what they've done. That's something that is very different to, a victim of a bushfire. So there's quantifiably differences in the notions of trauma. I think the other distinction is between what we might call clinical and subclinical presentations and manifestations of it. So PTSD is very well known, but it's not the only form that trauma takes. You can have traumas of omission, things that happened to you when you were a small child that you didn't get what you needed. That can cause a traumatic effect. You can have historical and transhistorical traumas. Here I'm thinking about the works of Agnes Heller, famous Budapest school philosopher, and she spoke about transhistorical traumas that, not intergenerational trauma as it's often used, but transhistorical traumas, things like the Holocaust or the Shoah, things like these, like the Atlantic slave trade, that doesn't matter who you are. It actually, the fact that the Holocaust was possible influences you and I. It influences us. It influences our perception. Think about how we're feeling at the moment about Putin. Here we've had a period where war by invasion has not been a stable point of our globe for a while. A lot of civil wars, but just invading and taking a place over, that's kind of breaking the rules now. We thought we'd move past that. You notice the alarm that's going on with it. People are super alarmed about it. But why are we alarmed? And this is part of history, is the last time this happened in Europe, it cost millions and millions of lives. It resulted in the generation of nuclear weapons, which have the potentiation to eradicate life on Earth. So there's this response. So I think this idea of trauma is a powerful one. It's an important one. It often gets kind of bandied about, I think, in ways that actually diminish what it actually means. You know, people like, I missed my bus, it was so traumatizing. You know, well, no, it's not. That's not trauma, guys. Yeah. That's inconvenient. You might have suffered, you might have been stressed, but it's not the same. And I think that distinction is important. In terms of the ubiquitous of it, I think it is highly present. It's highly present because as a species, you know, Walter Benjamin said, history is a wreckage of blood and bodies. Right? That's what history is. The angel of history is a wreckage of blood and bodies. That's human life. Pestilence, war, famine, death. You know, this is what we have gone through as a species. And pretty much the last 70 years is really the only time in human history where we haven't had large portions of people shipped off to die in war. You know, like there's been wars, but we haven't had that kind of quality. And I think one of the consequences is it's allowed people to feel safe enough to actually begin to feel what all of human history is transferred. When we're doing trauma work, we say what is not transformed is transferred. And so when you think about what's been transferred through human life, through human experience, all the, you know, where are your grandparents from? What did they go through?
Well, they were part of that Holocaust.
There you go.
And I know you talk about trauma being transferred. I mean, I know that at the age of 10, I would sit in my public school in year 4, 3, and I would wonder who would be with me and who would be against me if push came to shove. And that's not the thought of a normal 9 or 10-year-old.
No, and that's a great example of this trans-historical thing, right? Like it moves through time, and then you have the intergenerational bit, which is it's actually transferred directly into you. And so I think we're in this incredible moment of sensitization to these problems. And I think that if we are wise and sensible about that, we can find a way through. What I'm noticing is with this attempt to sensitize to it, you know, and I think it's that sensitization which has given rise to kind of the whole kind of woke space. I think if we're not careful, though, what it does is it creates an abreaction. And you see this is happening a lot.
Creates a?
Abreaction.
Abreaction.
A counter reaction that's inverse, right? That there's a whole bunch of people who become more solidified in not wanting to be like that. So rather than being sensitized to these problems, what we find is like the rise of a kind of hardness in how we want to treat each other. And you see this politically and socially and all those type of things. You see this rise, and that kind of polarization is always dangerous. You know, I think when we have polarization in the way that we're currently experiencing it, I don't think it's a good recipe for a long-term stable society. And you know, there's a lot of poor incentives that are driving that.
Yeah, which brings us back to the response to this pandemic. You mentioned about bad data leading to bad decisions, but when that bad data is broadcast to inform the masses, the social psychology, and I've even heard it described as mass psychosis, which emerges from that. When you hear something like that, given your psychotherapy and psychology, psychiatry, philosophy background, when someone says, I think the population is suffering from a mass psychosis, or maybe that's too strong a word.
That's too strong.
Too strong a word, but certainly fear and isolation and simple solutions.
Yeah,
what's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because there's also a supposition here which I think doesn't get expressed enough, which, you know, as well I'm all in favour of the sensitization and the gentleness of our species, there's also a sense in which the values of what we're able to endure. I mean, it's been really interesting watching the response to this. I mean, I'm not trying to diminishing how harrowing it's been for many people to be isolated. I know that it has been, been at the coalface of that. I understand that. But it's also something interesting about the resources that people have. And, you talked about the data, but I often think the thinking tools are the missing bit, the way in which we make sense of these things. I mean, so I said I've got a serious heart condition. My doctor didn't want me to have the initial vaccines. I'm like, no worries. He's like, I want you to have the protein vaccine when it's here. So I've been in isolation for 9 months. Wow. I only got out of isolation a week ago. Got my vaccines and whatnot. And
so this was the Novavax, which is the old-fashioned technology.
That's right. And so they gave me that, and it was like, okay, you can go back into the world now. And I wouldn't say that the 9 months in isolation is very easy to do. No. But I can work from home. I've got food. I've got shelter, I've got clothing, I'm like...
So you might have been suffering a bit, but you weren't traumatised.
No, exactly. And I don't mean that to be pejorative, right? I'm not saying that people who did find it very hard should feel like I'm having a go at them, because I'm absolutely not. What I'm saying, though, is that the thing that makes the difference for me is being able to think and write and read and use the things that are at my disposal in that environment. And I think that that's often what's missing, is that a lot of us don't have well-developed practices for living. And I often talk about this. What is a practice? Practice is a non-trivial task performed over time with intention. That's what a practice is. And so what are people using in these moments to cope, to manage? Where are the practices?
But Traill, I would argue that you have the perfect preparation. You've had the perfect preparation for 9 months of isolation. You've done... your philosophy, you've obviously been interested in philosophy and psychiatry and psychotherapy. And if that happened to me, which it happened for a few months at a time, and I thought, wow, this is great. I can actually slow down and think and all that. But a lot of people weren't in that privilege, that kind of assumption that everybody's going to have a laptop and everybody will have a desk to sit at and everybody will...
No, exactly.
So, I think you more than me probably, were even, you probably looked at it like, wow, this is like a Vipassana retreat.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm not, I just want to be clear, it's not a criticism to people who did find it hard or anything.
But 9 months is...
But there's a kind of quality here about what are we prepared for as people? What are we actually prepared to cope with? What are our thinking tools? What are we actually given to make sense of? And I think a lot of people's lives are so incredibly hurried and busy that the chance to actually even ask that question is very, very hard to create. And I think that's not a complete accident either. I think our society has sped up. I think there are our involvement with certain technologies, I think, is really problematic and hasn't been thought through at all. I mean, the effect of social media on mental health for young girls in particular is just like, when you look at the research and the data on the effects of social media on young girls, it's hard to imagine how we allow people to here, Jonathan Haidt's obviously written a lot about this.
The coddling of the American mind.
Yeah, he's written a lot about this. And it's so interesting as well, isn't it, that the only people who are raising these kind of stringent criticisms of this space are kind of white male conservative thinkers, and that's part of the challenge. And then I think about someone like Cornel West, who's just, in my mind, one of the most important thinkers around.
And still going strong?
Yeah. Still you're one of the most important thinkers on race and culture. I mean, I know that he's got a very nuanced reading of this, and he's got these kind of deep traditional kind of intellectual approaches. But everything's kind of categorized for him through the Christian kind of lens of love. And if I was to really kind of think about what are we starting to miss as a culture? Where are we really missing with each other? it's really the fraternal bonds. It's really like that idea of actually loving and connecting with our fellow citizens. Instead of that, we're often in opposition to, we're often trying to find out what they did wrong, we're often trying to jump on them and crucify them and point the finger. And there's a real lack, I think, of generosity and kindness and compassion and love.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the first questions I was going to ask you was about evolution, because I'd never really thought of evolution as a political statement.
Yeah.
But, you know, you talk about criticism, competition, you know, this is survival of the fittest and the selfish gene on the one hand, which kind of suits the narrative of our economic system. But when I know I was reading about the theory of evolution out of Russia, which was more synergistic. It was a more synergistic model of collaboration. When two cells came together, something really amazing happened.
Yes. Well,
when all cells work together, something real, you know.
Well, I mean, you use that term collaboration, which I'm really pleased to hear you say, because the notion of collaboration is in some ways the fundamental defining characteristic of our success as a species. I mean,
absolutely.
As E.O. Wilson famously said, you know, human beings are more social than ants and bees. So, you know, you think about how collaboration and relational connection has been so intrinsic. I mean, an ant from one nest doesn't trust the ant from another nest, but we can get onto the computer, ask somebody in Iran to do some work for us, put some money into an account, and we can have this exchange and collaboration. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary that we have that capacity. And so this collaborative ability, I think that's the kind of issue that's breaking down in some ways that we really need to return to, is finding a way. You know, we're more connected than we ever have been, but people also feel and seem more alone than they ever have been.
I think this is part, you mentioned about education, that where is the return on investment for doing a psychology degree, a philosophy degree, you know, how's that going to make money? But I think this speaks to a much bigger issue about where we've been over the last, since the war really, in this sort of neoliberalism, let the market dictate. And so this narrative, and that's another word that I used to think narrative was a description of a story or something, but now it's actually the news we get is a narrative.
It is, yeah. It's a perspective.
So I wonder whether this whole problem is a reflection of a sort of a neoliberalist approach to life, market driven. Everything's got to be money, money, money. But for the most people, we want to collaborate and come together.
Well, I think
it's just this tension.
I think there's a huge feature of the human being which is all about that. And one of the problems with kind of this, you know, this neoliberal kind of economic model is it's wrong.
Yeah, I couldn't agree.
I mean, it doesn't work. Unbridled capitalism is a disaster. And people who say that it's not, I'm like, well, look at the planet. This is unbridled capitalism. Look at what's happening. Now, I'm not saying capitalism is bad. I'm saying unbridled capitalism is bad. And so I think the capitalistic model is probably the best economic model we have. But does it need constraints? Yes, because it needs to work in service of the species. It needs to work in service of the community. It doesn't do that. It works in the service of very, very few people. And that's a problem. And, you know, if someone had, you know, 30 billion magazines in their house, you would think that they were very unwell. Yes. But Gina Reiner hoards $30 billion. It's something that we should be like praising. Like, isn't this a wonderful thing? No, there's a problem here, and we'll need to resolve this. I mean, it's interesting, you know, how much attack gets leveled at kind of cultural Marxism, whatever that is. I don't even know what it is. I hear people talk about it, and I've, you know, read this stuff for a long time. I don't even know what they're talking about. But you think about the essential criticisms of Marx, and Marx is one of those interesting people. He's like Freud. He gets everything right and everything wrong. His criticisms of capitalism, I think, are some of the most astute we have. I mean, his solutions are problematic and don't work. But the criticisms and the problem of capital are interesting. So if you think about Marx's kind of idea here, he talks about the alienation from the means and modes of production. He talks about alienation from ourselves. He talks about alienation from each other, and in particular, alienation from our creativity or generativity. I mean, these are real issues. These are real issues.
Big issues.
These are real issues. And there's something which goes against the essence of human nature. I mean, Henry Ford famously said, "Why is it any time I need a pair of hands, I get a brain?"
Okay.
Yeah. Because the notion is like, I don't want a thinking, feeling human being. What I want is a machine. Yeah. And now we're heading towards a time where that's on the cards. And so what happens to all the people? And so you hear all this talk about universal basic income and all these kinds of things. And I'm like, well, that sounds a lot like socialism.
Yes,
but we won't call it that.
We'll
call it that. And I think there are models of social success that are better than others. I mean, I think some of this democratic socialist countries, in Scandinavia and stuff, have good social infrastructure and support. I'm not saying that they've got everything right. There's clear issues. I feel like those countries in particular have not done a great job in managing immigration and the effects and integration of different cultures. I'm sure many of your listeners know Douglas Murray. I was having a conversation with him a couple of years ago, and he's a conservative thinker, and I had to say that much of what he was saying, I was like, this is pretty sensible. I mean, I don't agree, but you're being pretty level-headed in our conversation. And so there's something about discourse as well, Ron, like our actual ability to listen and talk and hear.
And not think you have to agree with everything. I think, you're either with me or you're against me. There ain't no in between.
That's right.
That's what seems to be have been happening. I think it came to a head really with Trump, and he made a career out of it, polarizing people and making us doubt everything. But I think this period now has brought a lot of people together, I think.
Well, there is, but there's also this kind of, it's interesting. I think that is happening, but the spirit of that contrarian spirit, dressed up as skepticism, right? Like it's always, I'm a skeptical free thinker, but actually it's not that. It's just a contrarian position. It's not actually kind of really that open-minded or thoughtful at all. I think we have to overcome those kinds of barriers as people and as societies if we're going to move through this, because quite frankly, Australia is now identified as a captured state, right? State capture is something that's been a big buzzword now, but Australia is now being defined as state captured.
How would you define that?
It's a society or a country that has come under the control of another body, organisation, or group of individuals. And so, the amount of influence that Rupert Murdoch has in this country, for example, is, that's just a good example. But our politicians are in service of not the future of Australia, but they're in the service of, a small group of ruling elites. That's who they're in service of.
The idea of a government for the people, by the people, that's kind of rolls off the tongue very easily, but it hasn't been happening for a very long time.
Well, and it's always the great difficulty with representative democracies, right? I mean, Hannah Arendt famously said there's not a room big enough anymore. In Athens, originally 10,000 males, landowning males were the citizenry. That's who could vote. There's not a room big enough for that now, so we have to have representative democracy. But the question is about accountability around who our government actually represents. And look what's happened here in New South Wales. There are people, in northern New South Wales who are basically just left.
That's shocking.
When a government breaks the social contract like that, it's going to cause repercussions and difficulties. These people are all being paying taxes, they all identify as Australian citizens, all those things, and yet they've essentially been left. They were left. Citizens were paying for fuel for helicopters. People were getting in their boats and rescuing their fellow citizens.
Yeah.
This is a problem, because what you're not getting there is attention paid to what the government is actually there for, which is to protect, look after, support the citizenry.
But we have been able to build a $1 billion stadium on top of a stadium that was only 20 years old. I mean, there is it in a nutshell. Listen, coming back to trauma, because I know we connected through the Psychedelic Summit.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk a little about what potential this therapy has and why.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, so I am one of the directors of the Mind Medicine Institute, which is the clinical training institute.
I had the pleasure of talking with your co-director, Nigel Denning.
Yeah, wonderful. Very, very intelligent and wise man.
Absolutely.
And so, it's an interesting area, because psychedelics obviously have a long and important history in human life. First of all, I mean, it's really only the last 50 years or so that they've ever been banned. 1970, yeah. So
a market-driven band, one could argue.
Well,
not even
market. It was almost solely political. I mean, it was Richard Nixon, really.
But it created an incredible market for illegal drugs, and the war on drugs hasn't been particularly successful. Back to the history of psychedelics.
Yeah. So this long history. It's an essential feature. I mean, traditional cultures, but also in the origins of Western culture, ergot and things like that in the, Greek mystery schools, and its influence, on thinking throughout history is just so powerful. Like, people don't really realize how many people have been influenced by their experiences on psychedelic substances. Hugely important. I come to this work, though, not as someone who's evangelical about psychedelics. I mean, my view is that human consciousness and human mind has many potentiations, and there's lots of paths. The principle of equifinality, there's lots of ways to get there. I come to the psychedelic work with a very particular kind of register, which is that I want to see more treatment available for people who are not responsive to other treatments and who are suffering. And I've worked with lots of people over a lot of years, and it's incredibly frustrating and sad and devastating when all you want to do is help and support somebody, and it doesn't matter what you do, you can't quite get them there. And then we have this renaissance in the psychedelic movement, all the trials and research, and we're starting to, and people are remembering just how powerful they can be. And there's wonderful trials and studies done, and we're looking at the efficacy. And, we're talking about trauma. MAPS released their third phase trial results late last year, and the results are astounding. MAPS, yeah.
Go on, tell us about MAPS.
MAPS
is the
acronym. MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelics, and it is Rick Doblin founded this in 1983 or something. I can't remember when it was, but he's really driven this whole process about getting MDMA available for trauma treatment. And there's been a number of trials, and they've just done this exceptional job. I've done the clinical training in it, and it's just really, really, really amazing to see the work that Rick's done. To bring, he's really, I mean, he's got a lot of support now, and there's a lot of people on it. But when he did this, I mean, he must have just been a pariah. Like, he's just,
we're talking 80s.
Yeah, he's gone out on his limb here to really push this thing through, and he's turned it into this amazing force worldwide, but in particular in the US. And they're hoping to have MDMA available for trauma treatment there in the next couple of years, and it's on track to do that. And the understanding the relationship between the medicine and the therapy, though, is really important. Ron, because a lot of people just think that it's the substance, it's the molecule, right? And it's like, it's absolutely not that. And the whole deal here is that in this state alteration, you get the opportunity to do work that would be really hard or difficult to do in an ordinary state. So you get a chance to do the therapeutic work. It's not like giving somebody antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
You can't give it to them and lock them in a cupboard and come back and it's happened, right? It's really about setting up the conducive environment. So it's what I like to call the psychedelic complex, right? It's the molecule, it's the setting, the therapist, the skills, the team. All of those things factor into the outcome. And its potential, which is what your question was, its potential, I think, is hard to really grasp at the moment, because whilst we know that it's going to be extremely effective in the treatment of depression with psilocybin and MDMA for trauma, we don't know where the horizon of what's going to work for who. I mean, there's experimentation in treating Alzheimer's, all sorts of disorders with these substances because they increase neurogenesis. There's all these different kind of areas that are going to be opened up. But the real and essential message is that what we're doing is not working.
Currently.
It's not working.
Yes.
It's not working.
It's a great economic model. It's just not a very good health model.
Yeah. Well, Ben Sessa, very famous psychiatrist from the UK and a leader in this field, he put this incredibly eloquently, though quite challenging. I was like, I don't know that I would say that, but he says to psychiatrists, he says, since when did you become palliative care doctors? And when did you stop seeking to cure people or heal them? So, whoa, that's a
and that word cure in these intractable conditions like post-traumatic stress and chronic depression are not words that are ever really used.
No, and if you look at kind of remission rates for PTSD, somewhere like 5% normally. So diagnosis of PTSD, it's somewhere around 5% of people get better. With these treatments, you're talking about anywhere from 35 to kind of 68%. And they're expecting that number to climb when, there's more time to do the follow-ups from the trials. So it's going to be incredibly effective, in treating people who are suffering from these particular disorders. But I don't know where and when it's going to stop, because what it does is it creates a profound challenge to the whole basis of how we think about psychiatric medicine. One of the questions is this idea of, DSM or ICD-11, and there's these diagnostic categories. And the supposition here is that these are essentially natural things. Natural kinds would be the technical term. But what does it mean if you've got all these distinctly so-called different experiences that people go through, these pathological states, that you can treat them using one mechanism and you get a totalized change? It really has you beginning to wonder around what's going on. Now, in psychedelics, particularly with psilocybin, they talk a lot about the default mode network and the way in which the default mode network gets deactivated. And they talk about Friston's kind of free energy model, where essentially getting more information moving through the perceptual centers of the brain, which goes to the expansiveness and whatnot. But one of the ways to think about that, I think, might be to say that we perceive the world, and human life is built, human life is not accessed through neurons. It's not accessed through synapses or serotonin. It's not the register of human life. Human life is experienced. We encounter the world at the level of experience. And the way we experience that world is perceptually. When you create these profound alterations to perception, what you do is you create profound alterations to the world that the person lives in. So going back to my first point, what that person thinks is and what is knowable now change. And so you're talking about a fundamental change to how they understand themselves, the world, and the relationships they're in that world. That's huge.
Yeah.
So where that's going to stop, I don't know, Ron.
You talked about trauma being trapped, people in trauma being trapped, and you just touched on the default mode network. Because I think part of the mechanism there is really about unlocking that trap, making connection. Tell us about the default mode network a little bit more. I mean, people may have heard about it. Let's pretend they haven't.
Well, I mean, I'm certainly not a neuroscientist, but the general premise is that, and people want to look this up. Carhart Harris is the guru in this area.
Robin Carhart Harris. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But it's this perceptual network that basically is what we are. It's the way our minds, I shouldn't say minds, it's the way our brains orientate perceptually to the world. And if you think about perception, a lot of people like to believe that what they're seeing is what is actually there. Most of what we know from neuroscience now is that a lot of the world is actually put together by expectation, right? And everybody has this basic orientation. So if you're not doing anything in particular, you're just sitting there, just being in the world, that's the default mode network. It's this thing which, activates and it takes place, and it's it's the largest neural network, and it has this kind of effect. Now, when you take a psychedelic, it disrupts that. So that basic view of the world gets changed. It gets disrupted. It gets broken up. And so the world that you see, and this is why I much prefer to talk in kind of phenomenal language in terms of experience, the world you occupy changes. Wittgenstein famously said, a depressed man lives in a depressed world. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so there's this relationship between the world that we occupy, the world we experience, confirms itself to us every day.
Yep.
Yeah. So, if you look at things like luck or any of these kind of things, what the research shows is these are all expectation effects. People who feel lucky say yes to more things, which makes them more lucky, these kinds of...
Or you having a great day and you walk out and everybody looks so beautiful. What a great day.
Exactly.
It's that kind of perception. Or the opposite is true.
Exactly. And so what we're talking about here is reshaping the perceptual and experiential register of the life world. And so everybody produces this lived world. There's still this tendency to want to see the world as out there, as factual, what we might call naive realism. And, I can't imagine that there'd be too many quantum physicists that would believe in a naive realism. It's not really like that. I think a better way of thinking about it is that the world emerges from us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we are in a reciprocity with the world. And, one of my favorite philosophers is Merleau-Ponty, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, French philosopher, and he talks a lot about this notion of the reciprocity of the world. Mm-hmm. We are the world and the world is us, right? And we are a part of this. And there's a very powerful move in cognitive science towards something called inactivism. Okay. Which is this idea that the world and the mind are this co-created, co-related field. Makes perfect sense, but so really what we're doing is we're reshaping that. We've got an opportunity to actually create profound change at the level of perceptual experience. And so, when that happens, it changes people, and the people do not value experience enough in this space. Like, this is the thing that I've got a pet peeve about, is there's still a tendency to be like, it's doing this to this part of the brain and it's doing that. I'm like, that's all great. But actually what matters is the experience and the quality of the experience.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people, being so familiar with prescription medication, where a prescription is written and off you go and experience that prescription, this is a very different approach.
Completely different.
Just run us through a little bit, because it's not just, here, have some psilocybin mushrooms, good luck, and have a great time. That's not what it's about, is it?
No, it's the exact opposite of that. And this is why it's important. And there's a lot of prejudice still about this, because people don't really understand what we're talking about. All right. like, I'm not advocating for these medicines to be taken home and, done in your lounge room by yourself, right? Now, I am absolutely for the decriminalisation of these medicines. I think that that's like criminalisation of drug use generally is a real problem. But these are very powerful, and I think in any culture there are people who need to facilitate and hold anything that is this powerful. And in a traditional culture, it might be a shaman or medicine person of some description. In our culture, it'll probably be some kind of clinician. But the whole idea here is that if we know that the set and setting really matter, right? We know that that's important. The mindset the person has and the context and the setting that it's occurring in, they really matter. But in the therapeutic space, there's other dimensions. The therapeutic skill of the clinician, the role of integration in practice. I would almost go as far to say is the integration is probably more important than the actual dose session in this work. The integration of the experience and the perception. That's right, because otherwise what happens, and 120 years of transpersonal psychology tell us that the relationship between state and stage is important. States are transient by definition. So if you just have the experience, but you are unable to stabilize that in some way, well, you're just going to end up back where you were. If you weren't able to stabilize that into a stage or into a trait or into a view or whatever language you want to call it, you're just going to end up chasing your tail. The really important part is, how do I take this experience and actually change on an ongoing way my perception of myself, the other, and the world? And that's where the integration work becomes really essential. And Nigel and myself have, we looked, pretty seriously at the integration work. And, a lot of it was a bit clinically alarming, I guess. There's it just seemed like anything could go, like everything from tarot cards to, CBT. It was like all of it can be integration. And Nigel and I both, have a long history in transpersonal psychology, various traditions, but a long history in it. And we, have been working on this for, 10 years prior to all this coming to fruition. We've been working on these ideas for a long time and didn't necessarily think we'd ever get a chance to kind of, purvey this, but we were trying to work this through. And what this led us to do was to really think pretty deeply about the role of metacognition. And about metacognition. Go on, tell me. So metacognition is thinking about thinking in the general sense. It's most kind of probably the most clinically relevant description now is a term called mentalization, which Fonagy and Bateman, John Allen, those guys, they talk about this capacity to hold my mind and another's mind in mind. Right? That's what mentalizing is. And so it's a metacognitive capacity. And there's been a whole bunch of research done in this. The Rome School of Cognitive Science, they've got a kind of modular approach to metacognitive assessment in psychiatric disorders and all that stuff. But Nigel introduced me to Dan Brown probably 10 years ago now. And Nigel's worked very closely with Dan. And Dan, whilst being a professor at Harvard Medical School, is also one of the main translators of Tibetan Buddhist texts into English, and one of the most enabled teachers of Tibetan Buddhism. And he did something really interesting. He said, all this focus on metacognition functioning in pathology is really important. But what you're missing, guys, is actually on the other side, and going to the Eastern practices now, there's a whole system of metacognition which is connected to human optimization and potential. And that's all mapped out as well. And so it's like, okay, so the capacity to extend one's mind, to have one's mind in mind, becomes really important. And there are certain features, in particular, going back to what I said earlier about post-formal development, is you get this systemic and intersystemic awareness. Now, what that means, Ron, is that when people have, say, a psilocybin experience, around 80% of them have what we might call a mystical experience or a transpersonal experience. Another way of saying that is they might have a post-personal or post-formal experience. It's got this relational quality to it. They're able to experience all things. They, can feel the universe or whatever it is, right? These very big experiences. But if you just get them into integration and you just get them to just talk about what happened, the experience dies. It shuts down. And then what happens is to get back to it, they have to do it again. But with good integration work following a kind of metacognitive frame, what you're able to do is you're able to draw out the experience and stabilize it, because what we know is the longer a state is maintained for, the higher the likelihood of it stabilizing into a stage or a view. And so what we do is in that process, we keep that experience alive experientially. So if I was working with you and you were telling me, oh yeah, I could, feel the trees, and you're trying to get into the narrative, I'm like, and are you able to notice the trees right now? Can I ask you where those trees are in your body?
So that integration occurring while the experience is
not so much during. It's the integration is post, and so we have a number of phases of post work. You can do some metacognitive marking during the process with some medicine if it's appropriate, but generally we save that for the end, right? Because we don't want to interfere with a person's experience. But by doing that and marking that out and supporting them, what they do is they keep it alive. And so the perceptual view that they get, they're able to maintain it. And the longer that they maintain it for, the more likely they are to then have this as a stable event. And then they don't need to go and take these medicines to get back there. And I think this is the real message for me, is the idea is not the medicine. The medicine shows you a view which is a natural human capacity. And what we want to do is we want to stabilize that view. All right, so you don't need the medicine, but you get the benefit of the medicine. Like you get the benefit of what those substances have enabled you to have access to.
I mean, when you consider that people are trapped, and I guess we've all had stressful times where you've lay in bed and the thoughts have just gone round and round in your head for that night.
Yeah.
But if that goes round and round in your head for year on year on year on year, and suddenly a door has been opened to show you there's more beyond that trap.
Exactly.
That's a powerful thing. I mean, I've actually heard during the summit people talk about, I think 80% of people who experience this relate to it as one of the top 5 experiences of their lives. I can't think of any medical treatment that people would say that about.
That's based in particular, Rick Doblin did follow-up on the Good Friday experiment. And the Good Friday experiment, I can't remember what year it was done, 1968 or something, I can't remember, Walter Pankey. And, they took psilocybin, they're in a church, it's beautiful. They followed up on this, whatever it is, 40 years later or 30 years later, whatever it was. And still 80% of the people said it was one of the most significant experiences of their life. And so it raises an interesting question about the role of transcendence, right? So one of the things that I think is very important to think about in relationship to healing is the role of transcendence. So if we live in a world which is reductionistic, if we live in a world which is atomizing, if we live in a world that wants to do all of those things, how do we then make sense of this? How do we then, find a way of talking about a transcendent possibility for human life? And I would go as far to say is that transcendence is essential to human life. Carl Jung famously said, you'll only be truly healed if you have a religious experience. He also said the one thing that will stop you from having a religious experience is a religion.
It's a great idea.
Because he's talking about religion in the pure sense of it, a religia, to bind. To really be truly healed, you have to be contextualized within a greater system. In order to become yourself in the fullest sense, you have to get over yourself. And so this role of transcendence, which has been kind of stripped away, right? Nietzsche, God is dead and we have killed him. And, Nietzsche's kind of anticipation for the nihilism that was coming was so prophetic because we have to ask that question, where is a transcendent possible in today's society? Now, this might sound a bit, people might even be listening and already have a kind of reactivity to the idea of transcendence. What is this mumbo jumbo? You know, but that's actually exactly the point that I'm talking to, is that we feel that way about it. Charles Taylor, very famous Canadian philosopher, has written a lot about this. He wrote a very, very famous book called A Secular Age, where he talks about the creation of an immanent frame, that people are isolated. We're buffered. There's no capability of transcendence or outward movement. We're in these individual isolated characteristics. And he talked about that being personified by egomania and consumptive capitalism. You know, these become the mechanisms to alleviate the lack of transcendence. Yeah, I can't actually experience a transcending quality, but I can go and buy things that extend me beyond myself, at least for a moment. And so the role of the transcendent becomes super important, because if you cannot transcend, then no escape is possible, right?
I mean, part of the appeal of religion is the collective experience of acknowledging a greater force than yourself. The problem is the dogma that comes with it.
That's right.
And,
that's right. And that's rightly criticised and rightly addressed as problematic. But it doesn't change the fact that human beings require, in order to be truly fulfilled, I think, requires some sense of something bigger than themselves. Now, there's a lot of research into this. Edmund's work on ultimate concerns and all these things. We know that people are better when there is something bigger than them. And I think a lot of people just place this into work or into their immediate family as this is my transcending principle.
And it often brings the best out of people.
That's right. And so, but I think there's more. I think there is a space and a capacity for to open up to something bigger, without having words like transcendent or the sacred being kind of voodoo catch cries for imaginary friends and nonsense. I'm not actually at all purporting that, but Gregory Bateson talks a lot about this notion of what is the sacred. Well, the sacred is actually understanding the way the world is. That's what it really means. Because when you start to see the intricacies of life, when you start to experience the interrelatedness of the world, it gives you a sense of extension and reverence for the world that you're a part of for a very short period of time. And it is that which produces these values, like you were speaking about earlier, where stewardship and, you think about that idea of stewardship, right? An intrinsic idea in nearly every Indigenous practice on earth is this notion of stewardship.
Custodians
of the land. Last week, in this country, the environmental minister was told by the High Court that you are not responsible as a duty of care for future generations.
Wow. So I knew that case was being brought and it failed.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Incredible.
Right? Extraordinary. And
because there was a group of students or teenagers that were taking him to court.
That's right.
To say you are responsible for our
heard of court.
Heard of court.
Exactly.
The Environment Minister, Susan Lee.
Exactly. And I'm like, this is the problem. Here is an example. The justice system is failing. A lot of people don't recognise the history of. There's an interesting idea. Obviously, I go a lot to ancient Greece and whatnot from being involved in philosophy for so long. But prior to the establishment of Athens, the story is that justice was bestowed by the Furies, right? And they pursued blood justice, right? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, all those things. Athenia negotiates with the Furies to come into Athens. And it is that which gives rise to the justice system, right? And the Furies live beneath Athens and they move amongst the people wearing these red cloaks and all this stuff. But they are subdued whilst justice is being done. But when justice fails, the furies rise, right? So like the whole notion of justice is that if it doesn't satisfy the natural principles of justice itself, then it will fail because people will not be satisfied, and then people will take it into their own hands. The furies will rise. Here's an example of another institution which is not doing what it's meant to be doing. There's no justice in this. There might be a technicality. There might be some legal, some jurisprudence or stuff that means, fine, but it's still failing its purpose. And if you were to compare that to an Indigenous account, which would say, you are responsible as a custodian for future generations, and it is on you to do this differently. And that was extended not just to one minister, but to all of us as a people, all of us who are, adults, who are elders, whatever it is. It's a completely different view of the world. But the madness of all this, is one of those funny things is when you start talking about it, sometimes you feel like you're a bit crazy because you're looking around and like, how are you all okay with this?
I know. Well, that's the thing that's what this pandemic has really highlighted, an opportunity to reflect, and people are questioning what is important in life. But some of the conclusions people have come up with, really, are you an optimist? Let me ask you that. With that in mind, are you an optimist?
No, I'm definitely not. I describe myself as a hopeful pessimist.
Okay.
So optimism, I think, is a very particular American trait.
Geez. I was just going to tell you, I often warn people I work with that I suffer from chronic over-enthusiasm and optimism.
Well, enthusiasm is good. I mean, enthusiasm comes from the Greek enthusiasmos, means to be filled with a god, right? I'm down with enthusiasm.
Yeah, good.
Optimism, though, I think is a very particular kind of American trait, which is a belief that it will just always be okay. And
no, definitely.
And I think that's not. I think that's a silly idea, actually. I think it's a very privileged position to hold. That's why I always tell my students, if you suffer from optimism, just go and read some Russian fiction because it's completely uninfected by American optimism. You think about the effects of that on, we always expect a happy ending in the movies, like it's ubiquitous. But hope is different.
Hopeful pessimist.
Hope is different.
Maybe I can redefine.
Cornell would always say hope is on a tightrope. It's always in a balance. But hope is,
and it needs work, constant.
Hope is the attempt. It's the try. Look, this is probably not going to work out, but I'm going to give it everything I've got to see. Right. So my view is, I tend to have a more pessimistic kind of outlook on things. I don't. Like every pessimist, I believe I'm a realist. But the thing that I think is really important is not to slip into nihilism, which is what a lot of pessimistic people are doing. Is they slip into this. There's no point. There's no it means anything. No, that's a mistake. No. You've got to stay hopeful. And as Cornell would always say to me, you've got to go down swinging, either like Muhammad Ali or Ella Fitzgerald. But go down swinging, right?
Well, I might actually redefine that. I quite like hopeful pessimists too, as long as there's hope.
Without hope, we don't have a future. So the notion of hopefulness is a idea of possibility. And while there is possibility, there is a future. When there is no possibility, there's no future. So that's a deep problem.
Now listen, we've had such a great chat and it's been terrific. We could talk all afternoon and maybe we will, but I wanted to ask you one last question. And this is taking a step back from your role as a teacher and a lecturer and a psychotherapist, because we're all on a health journey together in this modern world. What do you think the biggest challenge is for us as individuals on that journey?
On health, I mean, oh my goodness. I mean, look, I would say probably the number one thing from my perspective would be stress. Stress is obviously we live in a highly stressful environment. We've got a very antiquated nervous system that's designed to respond to saber-toothed tigers and being invaded by the next, tribe over, that we apply to work deadlines and picking the kids up from school and all those things. So I think I think the management of stress and dealing with stress in the current environment is critical. I'm certainly not a bastion for optimal health. I've had some very serious health problems, and what I can probably share is, I guess, what I've learned about that over the time is the need to really listen to your body, to really, really listen to the cues that you're getting, and also to pursue what works for you. Many of my friends, just absolute true believers in homeopathics, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I can't understand how it's possible that it could do anything other than be a placebo. But if it works for you, do it.
I've heard it's a very powerful tool, placebo.
Well, whatever works for you, you do it. But what I would also say is you have to recognize the limitations of the model that you're being ensconced in, which is not a model of health. Right? We don't have models of healthcare. We use the term healthcare, but it's not actually healthcare. It's sick care that we have, right? And look, I have both been killed by a doctor and saved by a doctor, right? I have got mixed feelings about it. Okay, but if you've got a broken leg or you've got a really serious brain tumor or something, like, go and get conventional treatment for sure. But I always think of that analogy in Chinese medicine. I can't remember where this might be I don't know what book it's in, maybe The Yellow Emperor or something. And there's the brothers, and this brother wins this prize from the emperor, and he's like, well, but I'm not the great doctor. He's like, well, but all your patients get better. And he goes, yeah, but my other brother, none of his patients get sick. That's the doctor you want, right? And so what I would say is a proactive approach to healthcare is probably the thing. I mean, I'm a bit like this too myself. I don't really go follow things up unless I feel like there's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But really getting into a habit of taking care of yourself and preventively, I think, is actually the best advice, I think. I mean, getting Chinese medicine every week, for example, with me makes a huge difference to my heart function.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think, now the epistemological system of description, okay, makes no sense to my cardiologist, but the truth is I haven't been in hospital for this amount of time and I've been doing this and it seems to be working and I feel better on it. Mm-hmm. So I would say decrease your stress, focus on preemptive healthcare, not just when things are broken. Because when things are broken, it's hard to fix. And the other thing I would say about that is view your health as a totalized process of living, which is that we're in a totalized system and you can't be healthy at the expense of the environment you're in or the people around you. Like, these are a unified field. And if you start treating health and wellness in that regard, I think it starts to look really different for a lot of people pretty quickly.
Traill, what a great note to finish on, and I've so enjoyed talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Look, it's my absolute pleasure. I wish I'd got to talk to you more about what you're doing, and here I'm very interested, but it's lovely. Hopefully I'll come back sometime.
Well, that was quite a far-ranging conversation, and as I said at the beginning of the episode, if you need a reminder of the difference between meeting people face-to-face and talking to them online, today's episode was an example of that. I just lost track of time. I got totally absorbed in our conversation. I could have actually gone on and talked for hours with Traill. I thought it was really interesting. I hope you did too. We'll have links to his website, to also the Mind Medicine Institute, some information there, and Mind Medicine Australia, which is promoting the use of psychedelic therapies, which, as you've heard from both Traill and his co-director at the Mind Medicine Institute, Nigel Denning, has great potential. Now, I will reflect on this episode in this week's Healthy Bite, but I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences and conclusions.